So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's first speaker, Larry Osborne, Vice President with Ipsos's Public Sector Research Team. Larry, you have the floor.
Great, thank you, Ellen, and hello, everybody. Thanks very much for joining our webinar on higher education in the new America. We're excited to present some information very recently gathered from the general public and a targeted sample of academic researchers on the current state of affairs of colleges and universities. We think we have some really interesting insights to share today. As Ellen said, my name is Larry Osborne, and I'm part of the public affairs team working with our probability-based Ipsos Knowledge Panel for almost 2 decades now. And our presenters today will be Alec Tyson and Mark Schlesinger. Alec is the Senior Vice President at Ipsos, and he leads our Ipsos US polling team. And we're very delighted to have Mark as our guest speaker. Mark is a professor of health policy and a fellow of the Institution for Social and Policy Studies at Yale University. And his research focuses on a variety of medical related topics, and we've had the pleasure of working with him on a number of health projects over the years. So next slide, Alex. Alec. In today's session, Alec will be presenting our recently gathered data on things like the value of investments in higher education institutions, the varied impact of higher education, and how in touch higher education is with everyday American life. Mark will then discuss what gaps in survey research might reflect about today's environment, the perceived value of higher education, and share some thoughts on connecting research with lived experience. So, Alec, you can take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to be sharing this data as part of our Know the New America initiative, which is essentially our research-based effort to understand how shifts in the nation's political trends, economic trends, and demographic trends are not only reshaping the country, but reshaping opportunity for our partners. I really couldn't think of a better topic for one of these sessions, our Know the New America sessions, than higher education. It's an institution that's being buffeted by multiple currents of change. We can think about conversations around the value of a college degree with costs and affordability of a degree rising. What's the value of a degree? How well does it prepare a person for entry into this job market, particularly a job market that's facing so many disruptions by, for example, AI and technology? Ongoing discussions on campus about campus activism and social protest, and broader conversations about the societal value or societal impact of higher education. And then, of course, recent cuts in federal research funding to higher education. These cuts reflect, in part, a more active role for elected leaders in both state legislatures and even the federal executive when it comes to content and policy on campus. So for all of these reasons, we thought it was a great time for Ipsos to use our knowledge panel to collect new data on how Americans feel about higher education and to collect data from our academic friends. We see them as an essential part of this conversation, folks within academia. So what we're trying to do here is pair great public opinion data with insights from academia. So with that, let's jump right into what we found here. I want to start with the value proposition of a college degree. For decades in this country, it's been something close to inherited wisdom that a college degree sets someone up for success. So we wanted to test that idea and see its resonance today. And so you can see these 3 statements on the screen in front of you. And what we found is about 6 in 10 or slightly more Americans agree with the idea that a college degree provides more opportunities for someone in their lifetime, that it provides for the opportunity for higher earnings to earn more money over the course of a lifetime, and that in general terms, it provides the best way for someone to get ahead. About 60% also say that. So in the green, you see the shares who agree, about 6 in 10 basically affirm these 3 tenets of a college degree as being a path for opportunity. I pause here to say, though, that 6 in 10 is not 7 in 10 or 8 in 10. What you see in the unlabeled orange is the share who say they're not sure or maybe neither agree or disagree about these statements. And in the red, it's the shares who disagree, which can reach 10 or 15% in some cases. So while majorities still see a college degree as a path to greater opportunity for most, I would characterize this as having room to grow in terms of higher education making or reinforcing the value proposition of a college degree. One of the most interesting trends for me in terms of degree attainment, at least at the undergraduate level, is the difference between young men and young women today, right? And if you're familiar with that data, young women are about 10 points more likely than young men to get a college degree. That gap is wide and it's growing. So I wanted to look at this data to see if there are clues or insights about that trend in our own data. And I think this is an interesting, really kind of nuanced point here, which is young women are about 5 or 6 points more likely than young men to see the value of a college degree across the dimensions we measured. But young men also say this, majorities of young men also say this. So when I reflect on this growing gap in terms of men and women in terms of earning a college degree, to me, it's not as if young men are rejecting the value proposition of a degree. I think there are other factors there, maybe around identity, maybe around belonging or motivation, worthy of further explanation, but for here, a data point that suggests further research in my reading of the data. Let's step back from the personal lens of the value proposition of a degree, and let's talk about the societal or community impact of universities. The question we ask Americans here, 2 questions shown on your screen here. What's the impact of colleges and universities on your own surrounding community? And what's the impact of colleges and universities on American society generally? And we see interesting differences here. I think these are some of the more interesting points in the survey as we get into these. Clear majority of Americans, 63% say colleges and universities have a positive impact on the surrounding community. So many Americans live within close proximity of a college or university. And here we see clear sentiment that they see these institutions as having a positive impact on their own areas. A bit of a different story when you look at the impact on society generally. 48%, just fewer than half, say American colleges and universities have a positive impact on American society, but about as many say the impact is either mixed or negative, right? And that's really striking here, this more mixed national standing on the societal impact of academia. Bringing in some of those academic voices from the survey we fielded of academics, again, not necessarily a representative sample of all academics, but a useful reference point for us as we go through our conversation today. Perhaps not a surprise, but 9 in 10 from within academia said colleges and universities have a positive societal impact. So this is one of the bigger disconnects we see, and I think Mark will talk more about this, but clearly an area where there's more to do to understand this gap, where the public sees maybe a mixed societal impact and those within the institutions are much more positive. Let's stay on these same questions and break them down by party ID. It's an important element to understand. You see these same 2 questions, but broken down by views among Democrats and those who lean to the Democratic Party, and also by Republicans and those who lean to the Republican Party. 2 different stories here. Among Democrats, clear majorities see both a local surrounding community impact, a positive impact from colleges and universities, and a positive impact on society generally. They're pretty similar sized majorities. If you look to the data among Republicans, the story changes. A majority, not quite as big a majority, but still a majority, 56% see this local positive impact in colleges and universities. But only 30% of Republicans today believe that colleges and universities are having a positive impact on society generally. I think this is clearly a gap in opinion between where higher education leaders would like to see sentiment and where Republicans are, and a lot of questions or work to do to understand what's driving this opinion and what could be done to rebuild confidence among this segment of Americans. Shifting now to the funding portrait, and in the context of major federal cuts to research funding at many institutions, we wanted to understand how Americans think about state funding for public colleges and universities in your own state. We wanted to do this through a more local lens because we think folks are better equipped to offer opinion on a question like that. And you see the pie chart in front of you. This is a really striking finding. Almost 9 in 10, 87% of Americans say that they're in their own state, funding for public colleges and universities is a good investment. That positive sentiment outperforms some of the measures we've seen today, and I think it's a powerful endorsement of the role colleges and institutions play in local community, whether that's a local economic benefit, a cultural benefit, or even state or regional pride around a university or college that's in your area. But this is such a point of strength in our survey data and worth some reinforcement here, the strong support for state funding for public institutions. Shifting a bit more to a critique here, and that's part of what I like about this data, as you have a sense as we're going through it. American attitudes are very nuanced here. You're not seeing the same level of sentiment all the questions. Americans really make distinctions. And here we see a point of critique, a fundamental question for Americans. Do you think colleges and universities are in touch or out of touch with the issues you face in your everyday life? Almost half of Americans, 47%, feel that colleges and universities today are out of touch with the issues they face in their own life. Quite a striking finding. And if you can remember back a few slides previous, we saw really similar balance of opinion when it came to the overall societal impact. Folks with mixed views on whether colleges and universities had a positive impact on American society. I would draw a connection between those two data points. How can you have a positive impact on society if you're out of touch with the issues folks are facing? So I see some echoes or some similarities between those two data points. Clearly a point for improvement or further work for higher education here, the sense that many Americans feel that these institutions just aren't in touch with the issues that they face. Consistent with that theme, we asked folks about the need for reform when it comes to colleges and universities, and you can see this in the orange colored data, that there's a clear sense among Americans. 81% think universities need at least some reform. That view is particularly pronounced among Republicans, many of whom think universities need major reform, but both Republicans and Democrats here say, listen, colleges and universities, at least in my view, think they need at least minor reform here. So as I prepare to hand it over to Mark, some more voices from academia. I thought it was noteworthy that many within academia do see a need for reform within the college and university system, and many do acknowledge that colleges and universities were out of touch to an extent with the ordinary needs of Americans. And that's a frame that I would leave us as we begin to transition to the next section of the presentation. How do folks within higher education view themselves? How do Americans view higher education? The gap between those sentiments is an opportunity for more research. There's a lot of questions I think these data have raised for me. The Ipsos Knowledge Panel I see as one of the best tools to help go further on these topics, both keeping academic voices in the conversation and having accurate, high quality point estimates to understand where Americans, including subgroups of Americans by age, education, and gender, fall out on these important questions. So with that, I'll pass it over to the next segment of our presentation here.
Thank you, Alec. All right. Oops. Just getting command over the webinar screen here. We are clearly living in challenging times for American higher education. The academic respondents to the survey, which, as Alec pointed out, is a small, select, and hopefully insightful group, 95% of them said that their institution had been disrupted by recent changes in the academic context and funding environment. 61% felt that their own institution had been weakened by those ongoing changes, and 55% reported that they saw vital research that had been done at their institutions threatened by recent funding cuts. So those are challenges, and they're challenges which all of us on our various campuses are going to have to learn how to deal with and respond to in constructive ways. There is a natural tendency when times are looking dark and troubled to look for silver linings in that experience, and that is in large part what I am going to do today. Starting off by contrasting some of the public and academic assessments that we saw in the survey data, and Alec had already introduced us to, but then applying that to three different foci for thinking about how to draw inferences from that data. First, the extent to which the questions that are on the surveys, both for the academics and public respondents, and they're slightly different surveys, and I'm going to touch on that as we move forward, the extent to which those have been framed by the nature of current public discourse about higher education, I think in ways which neglect some important aspects of some of the debates over free speech and reform. Second, returning to the points that Alec, I think, very succinctly and clearly made about the value of higher education and how we think about the nature of investments and the public goods that are generated by those investments over time. And comparing how different framing leads to quite different assessments. Third, and perhaps most important, returning to the findings about American higher education being perceived as, by many people, as largely out of touch with the American public and American public values. What I want to do is conclude my presentation by thinking about kinds of research that can bridge that gap, can juxtapose science and public experience, not as two competing views, but as two approaches that can draw on one another and constructively inform one another in useful ways. So that's the game plan. Alec already pointed out that there is a large distinction on this question, which ended both the public and academic surveys on the general impact of colleges and universities on American society. Not only is there a substantial difference, 48% positive for the public versus 91% for academics, but the net positive is even larger, 91% net positive for the academics, 36% net positive for the general public. And although it's not surprising that those of us who live and work and have committed our lives to these institutions would be a little more positive than the public on these matters, the magnitude of that gap is striking, disturbing. As we move through the rest of the results, though, I think you'll see that there is a diminishing magnitude. This gives us a baseline to compare public versus academic perspectives. But as we move through the other questions, you'll see there is an increasing congruence between the different perspectives. And so we're going to make some sense of why that congruence grows as we move to the alternative framings of how higher education is being seen. The first point that I want to make in terms of thinking about the way the survey questions were framed on the survey for both the public and academic respondents has to do with a question that was only on the academic survey. And that has to do with the nature of free speech on American campuses. You see the wording of the question: how good a job have leaders at your academic institution done in addressing debates on campus over free speech and political issues? You'll see that the academic respondents were somewhat mixed, though leaning positive, shall we say, in their assessment of this performance. But the point here is that framing this as an institutional practice, framing free speech, free discourse, the sorts of open, balanced dialogue that we want higher education to produce, as something that only the leaders of colleges and universities have say over, whether it's through institutional neutrality or other comparable policies, is, I think, a serious mistake in terms of as moving this topic forward. And to show you why, I want to contrast the results of this survey and the results I'm showing you right now with the results of a survey that was done in the spring of this year that collected data from about 58,000 students on about 257 different college and university campuses in the US. That survey also asked about institutional policies, but extended the reach of the conversation about free speech to focus more on the environment within the classroom. And so these are the results that they found, and I'm going to warn you in advance, they're a little disturbing. So the survey of students asked a couple of different questions about discussion in the classroom. One was the extent to which students felt comfortable in expressing controversial topics, whether it was controversial in general or controversial with respect to the positions that had been expressed previously by their faculty member in the classroom. And in general, about half the students reported that they felt uncomfortable talking about those kinds of issues. If you look at the other side of that same conversation, the extent to which students self-censor during classroom discussions, the numbers are even worse because you have about 2/3 of the public, 2/3 of the students responding to the survey reporting that they had some relatively frequent forms of self-censorship. Now, on the one hand, these are pretty disturbing numbers, but I actually want to suggest that this gives us a way in to constructively respond to the free speech debate, not by having to struggle with institutional practices on particularly controversial issues, but by focusing in on how we relate to our students in the classroom, how we foster openness of dialogue in the classroom. In other words, moving this down to a level where we can more constructively respond because we as faculty members have more control over the nature of the discourse. So that's gap number one. Gap number two involves the results that, again, Alec introduced to you about the perceived need for reform. So, as Alec mentioned, about 31% of the public said that higher education is in need of major reform. The comparable numbers from academics were, again, skewed a little more positively. So only 17% of the academics talked about a need for major reform. But the point I want to make here is that reform depends very much on who you see as the actor who's the source of the reforming. I was reminded of another survey that was done in the spring, in this case of the general public, which noted that about 1/3 of the American public believes not only that higher education is in need of major reform, but that the federal government has both a rationale and a right to step in and both catalyze that reform and evaluate whether the reform has been successful. The fact that 1/3 of the public there supported federal government intervention is very congruent with the 31% expressed here in support of major reform. I'm fairly certain that the 17% of academics on the survey, when they said they thought there needed to be major reform, were not seeing the federal government as the source of that reform. But in the eyes and minds of the public, reform often has to come from the outside if it's going to be major. And we need to come to terms with that because it has big implications for the perceived autonomy of higher education. All right, all that's point number one, just a recasting, a reframing of the types of issues that were introduced on the survey. Point number two returns us to this question of valuing higher education. So, as again, Alec introduced, when we recast the value of higher education from the national level down to the local level, to what economists like myself would call local public goods, the surrounding community in the context of this question, public perception of positive impact shifts from about 48% to 63%, and the net positive, shown on the bottom of the graph, jumps from about 36% to 60%. So clearly, local higher education is being read in different terms. What we don't know is why. Is that the congruence of cultural values, of political discourse that is closer to the community when people are co-located with the campuses in question? Is it because there are more local public goods being provided, access to various kinds of talks, performances, and things on campus, access to campus spaces of various kinds, participation by students and faculty in the local community? We need to know more about what it means to have this higher level of local congruence. Similarly, when we shift the gears to the public investment results that Alec pointed out, which now go quite radically from what was 48% positive in the general impact to 87% positive in terms of a perceived good investment, the question becomes, is that because now we're at the state level? So again, there's greater congruence of political and cultural values. Or is it because now we're focusing on public colleges and public universities? And were we to ask the same question about private colleges and private universities, there might be a radically different perception on the part of the public. We don't have that question, so all we can do is speculate, but it does suggest that there is a difference between public and private, and we need to know more about that and what's driving public perceptions of those two different forms of higher education. Finally, third, what I want to do is return to the one place where there is the greatest congruence between public perceptions and the academic perceptions revealed in the survey. And that has to do with the question on whether higher education is out of touch. Not only does much of the public, almost half of the public, perceive American higher education as being out of touch with the everyday person in everyday life, but when you look at the academic results, they're almost as negative. So here we find congruence between the two different perspectives, and it's not a happy congruence because it's suggesting that a lot of the academic enterprise is perceived to be out of touch, even by those within the realm of academia. My point, and the point I want to conclude on here today, is that it need not be that way. And to show you some counterexamples, I'm going to draw on a couple of examples of my own research, with apologies that it's mine. It's not unique. I can think of a few dozen similar kinds of research projects and initiatives just on the Yale campus. I'm sure there are hundreds, if not thousands, on campuses all around the country. But what they both do is try to harness scientific rigor and use it to connect with public perceptions and experiences. Example number one involves a project that I and some colleagues have been working on for about a dozen years that takes large-scale public experience data on encounters in the healthcare system. Surveys that you've all had lots of opportunity to do, whether or not you've completed them. When you leave the doctor's office, when you leave the hospital, when you leave virtually every kind of healthcare setting to report on your experiences. What we've done over the past decade is think about how to include open-ended question sequences to collect patients' narrative accounts, their experiences said in their own words, in order to collect more concrete information about what those patient experiences are like. And what we've been able to show is that one can not only elicit those narrative accounts in a balanced and representative way, but one can feed that back to the healthcare system in a way that constructs active, constructive change that makes the healthcare delivery more congruent with those patient experiences. So again, scientific rigor being harnessed to support patient voice and to increase the impact of patient-centered care. The second example that I want to give also draws on narrative data, but it's not just focused on the patient experience, it's focused on the experience that patients have with healthcare and health more generally. It comes from something we call the Health Experiences Research Network, which is a consortium of 6 different campuses, researchers at 6 different campuses, at Yale, Johns Hopkins, University of Wisconsin, University of New Mexico, University of Utah, and the Oregon Health Sciences University. And what this consortium does is to do a set of intensive interviews, again, collecting and rigorously analyzing patient accounts of their own experiences. But it goes beyond the narrative research that I described to you previously by taking all of that data that we've collected, all that we've analyzed, and putting it on a public-facing website. So it is openly and freely available to anyone to access, not people who subscribe to academic journals, not people who even need to know how to read academic journals, but people can go on and learn for themselves about that experience. And it doesn't just present our analysis of those experiences. It presents the experiences in video, audio, or written form, depending on what the participants want. And it presents it in their words so that the public is hearing from the public about their experiences. And I believe that this stands as the kind of template where we can use all of our rigor, all of our academic acumen, all of our ability to help make sense of a set of complex experiences that can craft it on the bedrock of people's lived experiences. And by so doing, show that we can make the academic enterprise not only in touch with the public, but amplifying the impact of the public on everyone's lives. All right, those are my cases in point. I would argue if we had more investment in those kinds of research, if we disseminated that more broadly to the American public, we could help build and bridge some of that gap that currently exists on the in touch versus out of touch. And with that, I will conclude my remarks and open things up for questions.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Alec, for that very interesting presentation. We do have some questions for you. One is probably one that either could answer, and it's really, is there a baseline that we're comparing these current results against?
Well, Mark, maybe I can start and then you can offer your reflections. Is in some cases, yes, in some cases, no. I mean, one place that I would start is the perceived societal impact of higher education. We know that over the last 10 years, we have seen a downtick in that measure. It's measured slightly differently depending on the survey shop you're looking at, but part of what we've seen, if you recall the slide with very low perceived societal benefit among Republicans, that's been a driving trend behind this, that Republicans have grown more skeptical in recent years in our political environment about the value of higher education. So that is one trend change, or the reference points that I would suggest, is that overall standing in terms of societal contribution has taken a hit over the last 10 years here in the public's mind.
All right, I'll throw in my one bit. And again, my one bit in this case comes from the survey of students across those 257 different campuses. That data has been collected for about the past 5 years, and so you can get short-term trend lines in student expectations and behaviors. And disturbingly, over those 5-year periods, students appear to be increasingly intolerant of voices that differ from their own being brought onto campus, and increasingly likely to want to be disruptive of speakers who are presenting attitudes and perspectives that aren't consistent with their own values and preferences. And so there really is not just a challenge in terms of promoting free speech and kind of open discourse on campus, but the challenge seems to be growing. It's not clear whether that's happening because of what's happening on campus or broader social trends, social media trends, all the different things we're well aware about, but the problem is becoming more pronounced over time.
Great, thank you. Another question regarding the results that say 51% is in touch, 47% say that colleges and universities were out of touch. How might colleges and universities get back in touch or get back on the radar screen and back into the conversation?
Oh, that's a good question. Mark, why don't you want to start on this one?
Yeah, so I've already offered one suggestion with the example projects that I illustrated earlier, which is that for a chunk of researchers on campus, not everyone, the classics department, this is not going to help with. History department, this may not exactly help with. But for a set of researchers on campus, particularly in the social and behavioral sciences, our capacity to not stay within the bounds of the university, not collect our data only from talking to the college students who are sitting in our classes, but to collect data about public experience and public attitudes and public behaviors from the general public, so we can actually learn from them in an open, broad way. As the knowledge panel gives us a platform for doing in such an effective way, and no one was paying me for that advertising announcement, that gives us the capacity to be aware and respond to what's going on in the public sentiment, not simply stay internally focused. And I think there is nothing more vital than us doing that right now.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I would echo that. Something we talk to our partners and clients about at times is how well do you understand the folks who are least like you, right? The folks who you maybe disagree with or have the less in common. It's easy to understand people who we are sort of aligned with or have a similar view toward, or we all like similar things, but how well do you understand the folks who you are least like in the American public? I think that's the opportunity to help rebuild the resonance in daily life and perhaps some of that societal value sentiment.
Great, thank you. A bit of a follow-up to that question is this one. Is this out of touch feeling about politics, red versus blue, liberal versus conservative, or is it just a 30 to 40 year shift in attitudes toward academia, colleges, universities, as was felt during the 1960s and the 1990s connected to elitism?
Yeah, I'll start, Mark, but you're gonna have to help me on this one. I would say that absolutely our current political moment is a piece of this puzzle. It's similar to the comments I made a few questions ago. Higher education knowledge has always been political. The creation and the communicating of knowledge has always been political, but it's become more partisan in the last decade, arguably the last 2 decades, than it had been in other eras. So I want to hear more from Mark on this, but just from the public opinion data side of things, you have seen a market shift, even in a space or an institution that always had some differences, but depending on your political outlook, those differences are more pronounced, more acute today than they were 10 or 20 years ago.
Of all the panelists, I represent an era when I actually lived through in my college years the Vietnam War era, and so I can bridge the earlier challenges on campus to the contemporary challenges that we now face. And in many ways, they are remarkably similar. What is striking, though, when I talk to my students, when I talk to my younger colleagues, when I talk to the general public, is just how little people can remember about those earlier eras and those earlier times. Campuses have to always be challenged by social changes, and those social changes may move us rightward politically, they may move us leftward politically, but every time those changes happen, institutions have to figure out how they'll respond. But even more importantly, those of us who are teaching on campus, teaching to students, have to figure out how we are going to respond and incorporate that into our curriculum, into our classroom discussions, into the people we bring onto campus for other people to hear and learn from. That's an expectation which never goes away. It will be continuous. It will be what we have to do in order to make the campuses open enough that they can be responsive to these changes.
Great, thank you both. I do think that the webinar was scheduled to end at 45 minutes past the hour, but we do have some more questions, and we'll just continue, and understanding that some people may need to drop off. There are a few that are really survey related. So probably for you, Alec, here's one. Who are the academics interviewed in that part of the study? Faculty, administrators, public or private institutions, and a sample size of 64?
Yeah, exactly. And so we want to lean into the idea of academic voices, or sort of a reference point, almost like a qualitative focus group. These were academics who are in our network, who had worked with the Ipsos Knowledge Panel previously. They are primarily, but not exclusively, researchers. We also did extend the list to folks outside active research. So we present this data with humility, as much as a conversation starter or an accent point for the public opinion data, which is nationally representative, high quality Ipsos Knowledge Panel data. So there is a difference here, but we thought it would help inform the conversation to have a piece of context for that public opinion data. For me, it's an obvious opportunity for thought leaders within higher education to do a rigorous, high quality, large and representative study, and you could segment it by researcher, administrator, public institution by private institution. I haven't seen that in the marketplace, and I think there's a need for that type of research.
I agree with Alec on that. I think the one other thing to add is that on the academic survey, the respondents were asked to self-describe the kind of institution they were from, using some crude categories. And it's pretty clear, not surprising since they were knowledge panel clients or participants as in research, that these are largely respondents drawn from research tier universities. And that's going to influence the perceived magnitude of the impact of funding changes. Whether it influences the perceived in touch versus out of touch is a more interesting question. I don't know how that one would project, but it's clear that we're not getting a lot of respondents from smaller schools, from liberal arts schools, from other places that we need to learn more about and from.
The next question is, did the survey or related studies give respondents a chance to select reasons or signs of the disconnect that they're feeling?
I think the best we have for this study is to think about the connection between the variables. I noted the connection between a sense of doubts about societal impact and doubts about being in touch. I think those concepts could inform one another. We've touched on the idea of ideology, that the perception that colleges and universities, whether your own views on the world are aligned or not aligned with your perception of the viewpoints of higher education. I think that's one part of the story, but I think the real answer to this one is there's more to do. There's more to follow up. I think this was a stage one or a initiative, conversation starter, and absolutely that's on the list to follow up. Is how do we understand some of these differences or attitudes in more depth?
Yep. As a constant advocate of narrative research using open-ended questions, I will only say if we only had a few more of those, think of how much richer our analysis of this would be.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah. And then just two last questions that are survey related. One is, do those with college degrees or more have more positive views about higher ed across the board than those who do not have degrees?
They do. We looked at this in the background and it is in the expected direction. I would say that there are other differences that can matter more. We've mentioned party divides a couple of times. Age and gender are usually secondary to education, but there's an interesting interplay there. So absolutely, or to confirm the question that yes, folks who have direct experience with a college degree do report more positive sentiment across the questions we asked. But I would say that it's not an order of magnitude more, that there are other variables that also matter, some of which I just mentioned. But that's another thing I'd like to do is a more comprehensive evaluation of the primary drivers of attitudes towards higher education. Are they age? Are they education? Are they political? That's what I'd like to see more of.
Great. And last question in the chat. Did you ask respondents if they or someone in their family had a notable amount of student debt? If so, did those respondents differ than those without such debt?
We did not, and maybe I'll echo the same theme. I would love to learn more about that. That's where I opened some of my remarks about the ongoing conversations about cost, affordability, value, how well folks are being prepared for success. And student debt is absolutely a huge part of that conversation. So to confirm or underline the comment there, yeah.
Great. Well, that was the last question. We'd like to thank everyone again very much for attending our webinar today. We appreciate your attendance. And Ellen, I'll hand it back to you to close out.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all three of you for an amazing discussion with a lot of engagement from our attendees. If we didn't get to your question, we will do so by email. Also, be on the lookout for an email from us with a direct link to today's recorded presentation within the next few days. Of course, we always welcome the opportunity to speak with you directly, so please feel free to reach out to us. That now concludes today's amazing webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.